In the blood-soaked chronicles of Tudor England, where queens were dragged to the scaffold and kings drowned their realm in tears, there exists a tale that defies the usual script of death and execution. It is not the story of a woman's head rolling on the block, nor of defiant last words echoing through the Tower yard. Instead, it is the story of survival bought not through courage on the scaffold, but through submission, humiliation, and an almost terrifying patience. This is the tale of and of Cleves. The Queen Henry VIII refused to touch. Her story begins in an England already haunted by ghosts. Catherine of Aragon had been cast aside and left to die alone. Anne Boleyn had danced her final steps on the executioner's stage, her blood staining the stones of the Tower. Jane Seymour had given Henry his long-desired son, only to perish in childbed, her body broken by the gift that secured her name. Now, the king, bloated, diseased, and desperate for both legitimacy and alliance, turned his gaze to Europe once more. Thomas Cromwell, Henry's most cunning minister, engineered a match that seemed, at least on parchment, a triumph of diplomacy, a marriage with Anne of Cleves, a German princess from a Protestant duchy that could counterbalance the Catholic powers of France and the Holy Roman Empire. On paper, the union promised stability. In flesh and blood, it would deliver only horror. Anne crossed the seas in hope and duty, carrying with her the rich dowry of her family, chests of tapestries, jewels, garments, and the weight of political expectation. She came not as a stranger, but as an ally. Yet in Tudor England, alliances meant little when measured against the diseased vanity of its king. For Henry was no longer the golden prince who had once dazzled Europe with his athletic grace and towering charisma. By the 1540s, he was a man rotting from the inside out. Chronic ulcers on his legs oozed pus and blood, poisoning the very air of his chambers. His swollen body could barely be lifted into armor, and his pride, once sustained by conquest and seduction, now shriveled under the cruel mirror of time. He demanded that the women who shared his bed validate a fantasy, that he was still virile, still desirable, still a god among men. And when Anne of Cleves failed to ignite that fantasy, her fate was sealed. She would not be executed. No blade would claim her life. Instead, she would be condemned to something far more insidious, the slow, public humiliation of being the queen a king could not bring himself to touch. Anne of Cleves did not cross the seas for love. She came as a sacrifice upon the altar of politics, a pawn in the endless chess game of Europe's warring powers. In the winter of 1540, England was cornered, its king no longer the radiant lion of the tilt-yard but a swollen, diseased tyrant desperate to clutch at legitimacy before his body betrayed him completely. Henry VIII had already burned through wives with the same reckless appetite with which he devoured banquets. Catherine of Aragon was cast aside after decades of loyalty, discarded like a tattered garment. Anne Boleyn, once the spark of his passion, was dragged to the block, her head severed in the blood-stained yard of the Tower. Jane Seymour gave him the son he craved, only to die in childbed, her final gift a corpse swaddled in linens. By the late 1530s, Henry was both widowed and weary, his once golden image fractured by the rot of age, obesity, and scandal. Europe was watching. France and the Holy Roman Empire, long enemies, had begun to reconcile. A Catholic axis loomed, threatening to strangle Protestant England in a noose of isolation. For Henry, marriage was no longer merely about lust or legacy, it was about survival. Enter Thomas Cromwell. Cold-eyed, cunning, and tireless, he had risen from nothing to become the king's most trusted minister. Cromwell understood that England could not stand alone, and so he reached across the continent to the Duchy of Cleves, a Protestant stronghold whose alliance could shield Henry from Catholic aggression. The plan was elegant in its simplicity: bind England and Cleves in matrimony, and with it, weave a cord of Protestant unity strong enough to keep the Pope and Emperor at bay. On parchment, the match was perfect. Anne of Cleves was no frivolous court beauty. She was disciplined, raised in the austere German tradition, modest in manner, and, most importantly, untainted by scandal. To Cromwell, she was the ideal solution. To Henry, she was meant to be both queen and shield, her body a political fortress against Europe's enemies. But politics is rarely so neat. Behind the gilded promises of alliance, shadows festered. Henry, vain and delusional, still demanded that any bride inflame his crumbling sense of masculinity. He was no longer the prince of golden tournaments, yet he insisted that a woman's smile, a woman's body, should restore to him the vigor of youth. Cromwell had calculated the politics, but he had not calculated the diseased fantasies of his king. And so, the marriage that was meant to save England was already cursed. The ink was not yet dry on the treaties, yet the shadow of humiliation, betrayal, and blood was already gathering. For Anne of Cleves, stepping into Tudor England was not the triumph of diplomacy, but the beginning of a nightmare. As the marriage treaties were inked and alliances whispered in candlelit chambers, Henry VIII himself was no longer the splendid monarch who had once thundered across tiltyards in golden armor. The prince who had dazzled Europe with his athletic frame and radiant charisma was gone. In his place stood something far more grotesque, a king collapsing under the weight of his own body and his own disease. By the late 1530s, Henry had become a prisoner inside his own flesh. He was monstrously obese, his legs swollen and ulcerated, leaking pus and blood that stained his linens and fouled the air of his bedchamber. The once vibrant smell of roses and perfumes that had followed him through court was replaced with the stench of decay. Servants, gagging beneath scented cloths, struggled to attend him. Some whispered that the king was rotting while still alive. Medical knowledge of the day was pitiful against such affliction. His physicians, fearful of their master's wrath, could offer nothing more than endless bandages, ointments that festered on his skin, and heavy doses of opiates to dull the pain. But the more his body failed him, the more his mind unraveled. His temper grew erratic, his paranoia sharpened. In every glance, every whisper of the courtiers around him, Henry saw betrayal, mockery, and contempt. This decline was not merely physical, it was psychological. The once proud athlete who had tilted against Europe's finest knights could no longer mount a horse without mechanical hoists. He who had once leapt gracefully in courtly dances now shuffled heavily through corridors, leaning on attendants, his face purple with exertion. Every mirror mocked him, every movement reminded him of the prince he had been, and the monstrous relic he had become. And so, Henry turned to dangerous illusions. His physical weakness became, in his mind, a reflection not of illness, but of the inadequacy of those around him. If his body could not rise to passion, then surely it was not his fault, but theirs. Every woman he looked upon became a test, every bride a threat to his fragile sense of masculinity. His ulcers, his stench, his exhaustion, these he twisted into accusations against others. A king who could not admit weakness instead weaponized his decay, turning it into a weapon of humiliation. By the time Anne of Cleves was chosen, Henry was no longer simply a man seeking a queen. He was a tyrant drowning in his own corruption, searching for someone, anyone, to bear the burden of his rotting pride. The Golden Prince of Europe was dead. In his place ruled a king whose body was a tomb, and whose mind, darkened by pain and shame, would soon condemn an innocent woman to infamy. Before Anne of Cleves ever set foot in England, her fate was sealed by the stroke of a painter's brush. Hans Holbein, the king's court artist, had been dispatched across the seas to capture her likeness. His task was not merely artistic, it was political, diplomatic, and potentially fatal. Holbein's portraits were known for their honesty. He painted what he saw, no flattery, no embellishment. And what he saw in Anne was a woman of composure and dignity. In the portrait, Anne appears serene, her gaze calm, her features softened beneath the heavy folds of her German headdress. She is dressed in the austere style of Cleves, a vision of modest grace rather than seductive beauty. To modern eyes, she might appear pleasant, even attractive. To Henry's courtiers, it was enough, a princess of good blood, unmarred by scandal, and suitable to stand at England's throne. The canvas returned across the Channel like a sacred relic, presented to a king whose body was rotting but whose vanity burned brighter than ever. When Henry gazed upon Holbein's work, he saw what he wanted to see, not simply a woman, but a promise. A promise that this German princess might restore his pride, ignite his passions, and reinforce his crumbling power with the armor of alliance. The portrait fed his illusions, a fantasy that his decaying flesh still commanded desire. But the portrait was only paint. And paint cannot disguise reality. In January 1540, Henry set out to meet his bride at Rochester. True to the courtly traditions of medieval romance, he disguised himself as a messenger, intending to surprise her, to witness her reaction to his presence before revealing himself as her king. In his mind, he imagined a scene drawn from chivalric tales, the disguised monarch, the astonished bride, the instant spark of recognition and desire. What he found instead shattered the illusion. Anne of Cleves, tired from travel, greeted the disguised figure with courtesy but no passion. She did not faint in awe, nor did her eyes widen with rapture. She bowed politely, as any well-bred woman would, to the strange man entering her chambers. And when Henry revealed himself, expecting a rush of delight, she merely offered the same measured politeness. In that instant, fantasy collided with reality. The king's pride, already fragile, cracked like thin glass. The woman before him did not reflect his vanity, did not mirror back the image of an irresistible monarch he so desperately clung to. To Henry, and was not merely disappointing, she was dangerous. Her composure became an insult, her restraint a wound to his masculinity. And from that moment, the campaign to destroy her began. On January 6, 1540, the bells of Greenwich tolled not in celebration, but in mockery. Henry VIII, though filled with revulsion, could not escape the political contract forged in ink and blood. The wedding to Anne of Cleves proceeded, yet the air was thick not with joy but with dread. Courtiers whispered that the procession felt less like a coronation than a burial. The queen-to-be was alive, radiant even in her German finery, but she walked a path lined with shadows. The chapel was grand, its walls adorned with gold cloth, the aisles heavy with incense. But beneath the spectacle lay a sinister undertone. Henry, swollen and sour, stood beside and with the expression of a condemned man. His eyes narrowed as he forced himself through the vows, lips curling in disdain. Witnesses later remarked that the king's face, twisted with disgust, betrayed the truth. This was not a union, but a public humiliation dressed as ceremony. When the newlyweds were led to their chamber that night, expectations of consummation loomed. But the king avoided his bride. Henry, his body fetid and failing, could not face the truth of his impotence. Instead, he constructed a lie that would echo through centuries. By morning, he began whispering to his physicians that Anne was no virgin, that her body was repulsive, that she carried with her a stench no man could endure. These were not medical observations, they were the delusions of a king unable to confront his own decay. Yet in the theatre of the Tudor court, lies quickly hardened into truth. His sycophantic courtiers, eager to curry favor, amplified his whispers. Anne's German manners became clumsy, her speech foreign and graceless. Her modesty, once praised, was twisted into frigidity. Even her very scent was slandered, reduced to a cruel joke repeated in the echoing halls. The ridicule was relentless. Courtiers turned her misfortune into entertainment, jesting in feasts and smirking behind fans. To survive in Henry's orbit was to participate in his fantasies, however grotesque. And so the court became complicit in the degradation of a woman who had committed no crime but failing to feed a tyrant's delusion of virility. The marriage that had been intended as a beacon of Protestant unity became instead a grotesque masquerade, a living funeral for Anne's dignity. She had entered England as an honored guest and ally. Within days, she was reduced to an object of ridicule, her fate sealed not by the axe but by the venom of a king's wounded pride. The wedding was over. But the torment had only begun. The banquet halls were cruel enough, echoing with laughter at Anne's expense, but the true depths of her degradation were reserved for chambers far darker. It was not enough for Henry to whisper lies about her supposed stench, her foreign awkwardness, her failure to arouse him. Those whispers had to be sanctified, documented, transformed into a theater of humiliation that the entire court would recognize as truth. Physicians were summoned under the guise of medical necessity. They were ordered to examine Anne's body, to seek out the imagined flaws the king claimed to see. Her chambers became a stage of violation. Men of medicine prodded and judged, not in pursuit of healing but in service of a tyrant's pride. Women of the court, ladies-in-waiting who should have been her protectors, were enlisted to participate, peering at her body as though she were a specimen, not a queen. What had begun as political matrimony had now descended into something closer to ritual humiliation. The procedures were barbaric. Anne, once a princess of Cleves, raised with dignity and honor, was reduced to a prisoner under inspection. Every gesture, every blush, every silence was noted and interpreted against her. If she cooperated, it was seen as proof she lacked modesty. If she resisted, it was framed as evidence of guilt. In every way, she was condemned. Meanwhile, the court sharpened its weapons. Scholars scoured canon law to find grounds for annulment. Theologians debated whether a marriage not consummated could ever be valid. But these were hollow arguments, carefully shaped to confirm the king's will. The verdict had already been written. The body of Anne of Cleves was simply the stage upon which Henry's narrative was performed. And outside those chambers, the ridicule continued. Nobles smirked at feasts, ambassadors sent gleeful reports to Europe about the English king who claimed his queen was unclean, unworthy, unfit for his bed. Anne's humiliation became entertainment, both within the palace walls and across the courts of Europe. She was no longer Anne of Cleves, the Protestant bride meant to bind kingdoms together. She was reduced to a grotesque caricature, a foreign woman too ugly for a decaying tyrant to touch. It was an agony worse than death. For death, at least, could be noble, defiant, final. But this was a slow strangulation of dignity, a living spectacle in which every whisper, every mocking glance stripped away her honor piece by piece. The annulment was coming. And everyone, physicians, courtiers, nobles, was complicit in preparing its stage. As Anne of Cleves endured the slow erosion of her dignity, another figure entered Henry's orbit, Catherine Howard. She was everything and was not, young, pliant, English-born, and untouched by the burdens of statecraft. Barely more than a girl, Catherine was thrust into the spotlight as the embodiment of what Henry believed he deserved, and as a weapon to deepen Anne's humiliation. To the aging, rotting monarch, Catherine appeared as a vision of rebirth. Where Anne represented diplomacy, restraint, and foreign discipline, Catherine radiated youth, innocence, and docile charm. Henry, consumed by the decay of his own flesh, looked upon her as a salve to his wounded pride. Courtiers quickly understood the shift and turned their gaze toward the young girl, their flattery fanning the king's delusions. For Anne, the comparison was unbearable. In public, Henry flaunted Catherine's presence, treating her as if she were already queen while his actual wife sat in shadows, diminished and mocked. Anne's German formality was twisted into stiffness, her maturity rebranded as unattractive age. Each smile from Catherine became a dagger, each glance of Henry's diseased eyes toward the girl was a declaration of Anne's worthlessness. And Europe watched with fascination and scorn. In France, courtiers composed cruel satires mocking Henry's inability to consummate his marriage with a decent German virgin. The French king laughed at the sight of England's monarch, bloated, desperate, hiding his impotence behind slander. In Spain, ambassadors seized on Anne's humiliation as proof of England's instability, warning their sovereign that Henry's kingdom was ripe for exploitation. In the Holy Roman Empire, whispers spread that England had descended into barbarism, where even princesses were dragged into the mud of public shame. Anne's suffering became more than personal, it was a diplomatic weapon. Her body, her reputation, her tears were repurposed as symbols of Henry's decline, fueling the calculations of kings and emperors across Europe. The annulment was no longer a domestic scandal but an international spectacle, shaping how other nations viewed England's strength. And all the while, Catherine Howard smiled shyly in Henry's presence, unaware, or perhaps willfully blind, to the role she played in this grotesque theatre. Her youth, her charm, her very existence became the blade that cut and down further. The court watched with cruel delight, the old lion parading his new conquest before the woman he had discarded. For Anne of Cleves, the arrival of Catherine Howard was not simply the loss of her crown. It was the final confirmation that her marriage had never been about her. She was nothing more than a mirror, shattered because it failed to reflect the image of virility Henry so desperately clung to. By the summer of 1540, Anne's fate was no longer in her own hands. The machinery of Henry's court had already begun grinding forward with ruthless efficiency. Lawyers pored over canon law, theologians twisted scripture, and courtiers whispered arguments rehearsed to fit the king's will. The case was simple because it had been predetermined, the marriage had not been consummated, therefore it could not be valid. Consent, they declared, had been flawed. God himself, they claimed, had never bound Henry to this foreign bride. Anne was summoned. She had no choice. With the weight of England's court pressing down upon her, she was told to submit, to acknowledge the fiction that she had never truly been Henry's wife. In return, she would not lose her head. She would be given estates, income, and a new title, the king's sister. To resist was to invite the fate of Anne Boleyn. To accept was to live. On July 9, 1540, the annulment was declared. In the same breath that erased her queenship, Anne was praised for her obedience, her wisdom, her natural humility. What the court called humility was in truth survival, the only defense left to a woman trapped in the jaws of Henry's vanity. But even as Anne signed away her crown, another drama unfolded in the shadows. The very architect of her marriage, Thomas Cromwell, found himself marked for death. Once Henry's most trusted minister, Cromwell had risen from the lowliest ranks to shape kingdoms, orchestrating alliances, dissolutions, and reformations. Yet in arranging the Cleves marriage, he had gambled on Henry's favor, and lost. The king, humiliated and enraged, turned Cromwell into the perfect scapegoat. On the very day Anne's marriage was annulled, Cromwell was dragged to Tower Hill. The crowds gathered, whispering in disbelief. Here was the man who had torn monasteries apart, who had bent the law to the king's will, now himself condemned as traitor. He knelt, his face pale but resolute, before the executioner's axe. One blow, and the head of England's master schemer fell into the straw. The irony was savage. Anne of Cleves had been spared, humiliated but alive, while the man who had crafted her fate was destroyed in blood. Henry had rid himself of a wife he despised and a minister who knew too much, burying both in different kinds of graves. The annulment was not simply a legal document. It was a funeral, one for Anne's dignity, and one, far more literal, for Cromwell's life. The irony was almost grotesque. While other wives of Henry VIII found themselves cast aside in blood, shame, or the cold silence of the grave, Anne of Cleves was given something no Queen of England had ever possessed: freedom. Her crown was gone, her dignity publicly shredded, but in exchange she gained a rare prize: safety. Where Catherine of Aragon had wasted away in exile, where Anne Boleyn's head had fallen to the axe, where Jane Seymour had died torn apart in childbirth, Anne of Cleves was permitted to live. Not merely live, but live richly. The annulment settlement granted her vast estates, incomes, and a new title, the king's sister. It was a fiction, a ceremonial cloak to mask humiliation, but within that fiction lay real independence. On her sprawling lands, Anne did what Henry never imagined she could. She ruled as a landlord with intelligence and resolve. From her German upbringing, she brought advanced agricultural methods, crop rotation, improved tools, better use of land, and applied them to English soil. Fields flourished, barns overflowed, and peasants, once starved by poor harvests, began to eat and work with renewed hope. The woman Henry had mocked as clumsy and useless became, in practice, a figure of prosperity. But Anne's influence extended far beyond farming. Her estates became havens. Scholars fleeing persecution, merchants seeking favor, and Protestant reformers hiding from Catholic vengeance all found protection within her walls. Richmond Palace, once a symbol of her exile, transformed into an unofficial embassy for Protestant Germany. And quietly wove networks of power, offering shelter, advice, and resources with discretion sharp enough to evade Henry's suspicion. Hospitals rose at her command. Schools were built, teachers hired, the poor clothed and fed. Her wealth, derived from the king's guilt, was poured into the people, creating loyalty far stronger than crowns or titles could secure. To peasants, she was not the queen rejected, but the noblewoman who had lifted them from despair. To Protestant allies, she was a discreet diplomat, smoothing the lines of communication across Europe. And all the while, she remained invisible when she needed to be. She played the role of the quiet sister, dutiful and harmless, careful never to provoke Henry's wrath. But beneath the veil of humility lay something more dangerous to the king's narrative, proof that Anne was not inadequate, but formidable. The woman Henry had ridiculed as a failure now thrived in ways that unsettled his legacy. In being rejected, Anne had escaped the axe. And in surviving, she turned humiliation into quiet triumph. While queens before her were marched to the scaffold or broken in childbirth, Anne of Cleves remained untouched, watching from the margins as Tudor England devoured its women. She had learned the most dangerous lesson of Henry's court: survival was not won through defiance or martyrdom, but through silence, patience, and an uncanny ability to vanish when the knives were drawn. She watched as Catherine Howard, the young girl who once mocked her by existing as Henry's new obsession, was dragged screaming to the Tower. And remained silent. She observed Catherine Parr, who carefully nursed the king through his final years, navigating the razor's edge of favor and suspicion. And did not interfere. While others gambled their lives in the dangerous theater of Henry's affections, and cultivated something rarer, invisibility. And it worked. When Henry finally died in 1547, bloated and rotting from the inside out, and was still standing. The golden prince turned monstrous tyrant was gone, yet the woman he had humiliated endured. She passed quietly into the reign of Edward VI, and later into Mary's court, balancing herself between shifting religious storms that tore England apart. And did not choose sides. She smiled, bowed, and endured, and in so doing she outlived the very tyrant who had dismissed her as inadequate. Her death came not with blood, but with peace. In 1557, at Chelsea Manor, and closed her eyes for the final time. She was 41 years old, her household gathered in solemn mourning. Unlike Henry's other wives, she left this world with her body intact, her head unsevered, her dignity reclaimed through survival. But Anne left more than a quiet death. She left a legacy that revealed who she truly was: libraries filled with volumes in German, Latin, French, and English, correspondence with scholars across Europe, collections of art and sacred objects that spoke of a cultivated, brilliant mind. Her estates bore the mark of reform and care, her people remembered her as a benefactor. The woman once derided as the Flanders mare was, in the end, something far more enduring, a survivor who transformed humiliation into triumph. She proved that the greatest victory was not won with crowns or swords, but with endurance. Where Henry sought to make her an object of ridicule, history has remade her as a symbol of patience, resilience, and wisdom. Anne of Cleves did not become a victim of Henry's cruelty. She became his final defeat.